Hey everyone, I hope everyone's good, doing good. Yeah, I this is part two. The last video I talked about was actually the 3DO. I mentioned the underrated game consoles. I talked about the 3DO. I still have that up to this day. I still play it and stuff like that. Maybe not as often as I should, but I still play it though. You know, right now I was actually playing, I forgot what it's called, Solar Eclipse, I think it was. I think it was that, Space Shooter. The only thing about that game is that, you know, up is down and down is up. But it's still a pretty good game, though. All things considered, it's still a pretty good game. You know, in that game, the objective of that game, you have to shoot enemies in order for your power gauge to go up. You know, if not, it's going to keep going down gradually, stuff like that. But it's still a pretty good game, though. And the console itself is underrated. Like I said, I like the controller because it's unique. You can turn down your television and you can hear it through your headphones, through the controller. Pretty awesome. Because, like I said, I mean, people bash the 3DO, but at least it's better. At least it's better than the Philips CDI, which has a control port. If you watch the Angry Video Game Nerd, he talks about that it has a control port in the front, one control port in the front, one in the back of the console. So yeah, and the 3DO has much more better games than the Philips CDI, at least. Other underrated game consoles, what did I talk about? Was definitely the Sega Saturn and the Dreamcast. Fortunately, Sega really did a fatality to themselves because they decided, hey, you know, with the Sega Saturn coming out, first of all, they flopped with the Sega CD and 32X. I mean, Sega CD was cool, but the 32X, they came out, they flopped with that and everything else. And then the Sega Saturn came out, and then they jumped the date ahead. You know, they were supposed to release it around Christmas time, I think it was, and they did not do that. They just decided, hey, let's go ahead and jump ahead, and they did that. And you know, consumers were like, what's going on here? And so they decided that, you know, the fans just got kind of PO'd at them and lost faith in Sega. So Sega's sales could not beat the PlayStation. PlayStation knew how to market. What they had in the Sega Genesis days, they obviously didn't have in the Sega Saturn days, because it was time to move to the next level in gaming, and they just couldn't do that. Nintendo could do that at that time, but Sega couldn't. But anyway, I'm going to make a separate video on that and other subject of video games. But yeah, the Dreamcast, they actually made some improvements. Actually, Sonic Adventure, they actually have official Sonic game. Instead of a port, they actually have an official Sonic game in 3D. A lot of people consider that to be the first 3D. The first actual 3D game that felt like a Sonic game. Because Sonic 3D Blast, they don't consider that to be the first ever 3D Sonic game, because that's just a port of the Genesis. And a lot of people didn't like Sonic the Fighters. I thought that was underrated. Sonic R. And I think that's the only Sonic games they had on the Sega Saturn. But the GameCube, they came out Sonic Adventure 1 and 2. And unfortunately, it came out with Sonic Shuffle, which sucked. And they had some other great games like Soul Calibur, Marvel vs. Capcom 2. They had so many great games for it. You know, unfortunately, it couldn't stand against, you know, its competitors. But I'm going to save that for a separate video in the future. But yeah, anyway, those consoles are basically underrated. I mean, and at least the Dreamcast had one of those cards that looked like a handheld, you know, system and stuff. But yeah, it is underrated. It's too bad that, you know, Sega had the innovation, just not great marketing skills, but it had great innovation for its time. Let me think of other underrated game consoles. The Atari, maybe the Atari 52, no, Sorry, the Atari 2600 was underrated. Yes, that game console was definitely underrated. You know, I remember that was the first video game system I've ever had. You know, and I had Kaboom and a few other games. And I just kept dying on Kaboom, but it was pretty cool. You know, for its time, that's what got me hooked on video games. And then the NES came out, I was like, wow. And I've been hooked ever since. Let me see, other underrated game. Oh yeah, the TurboGrafx-16 is underrated as well. I mean, that game console, instead of using cartridges or discs, it used key cards. Yes, key cards and stuff like that. And they had some good games like Bonk's Adventure, Keith Courage. They had Splatterhouse, I believe. One game that really did suck was Darkwing Duck. I mean, the NES version was way better. And they also had Castlevania X. Oh, I'm sorry, Castlevania Rondo of Blood. Super NES had Castlevania X, which wasn't as great as Rondo of Blood, of course. But yeah, that game console is underrated. I really do want to get the Turbo X. You know, that's the handheld game console that you could play all your TurboGrafx-16 games on. I really want to get that, you know, for when I'm out and stuff like that. Oh, and speaking of which, another underrated game console happens to be another underrated game console happens to be the first ever PSP. That is definitely underrated, but I have no idea why it's underrated for, because you know, that was a great console. I mean, I used that as my first MP3 player. I used to watch movies on there, and I had some great games on there. Like, for example, I had a Sega Genesis Classics. I had wrestling, basketball. I used to play the heck out of Need for Speed, Carbon, and Most Wanted. Those were awesome games. Those are awesome games for its time. I remember I had WWE SmackDown vs. Raw 2008. It was okay. It was okay. I just like the earlier wrestling games better. But it was okay, nonetheless. I mean, I liked it. I don't understand why, you know, it gets a lot of hate. I mean, PSP Go, I can understand. The PS Vita doesn't look bad either. I want to play it one day. But yeah, PSP Go sucked. The PSP was definitely underrated. Yeah, I think that's all the, I'm trying to think if there's any other underrated game consoles. And I believe those are all the underrated game consoles that I mentioned. The 3DO, the Game Gear, the Sega CD, the TurboGrafx-16, the Neo Geo Pocket Color, yeah, the PSP, the GameCube, the Sega Saturn, and the Sega Dreamcast was underrated. And I believe those were all the underrated game consoles. Oh yeah, the what's that Nintendo console that came out like years ago? Oh, the Virtual Boy's underrated. Yeah, right. No, that console's not underrated. But those are my underrated game consoles. I feel that are underrated, that they get appreciation. Well, gotta go for now. Be back with more vids soon. Peace.